This is Lucy Morgan. Welcome to video 4, and in this video we're going to get down into what departments are impacted by the change to the new OMB Super Circular. And in this video, this is really where the rubber meets the road, because you're going to be starting that conversation with other functional areas about things that they may need to have put in place and may need to consider as you get closer to the full implementation date of December 26, 2014. So let's walk through the major impact points department by department. We've identified 4 departments that will have the primary impact with the change to the new grant regulations, and they are the Program Office, Human Resources, Procurement and Finance and Accounting. In the Program Office, the concept of performance measurements is probably something that they've heard of or have been working with in the last few years. But it's important for them to understand that this is going to have a much higher prominence with the new grant regulations, and they will be measured much more severely with performance measurements probably than any time in the history of federal awards. The second area has to do with the risk assessment of subawardees. This is part of the new grant regulations where both federal agencies and pass-through entities need to do a risk assessment prior to awarding funds to a subawardee. So the Program Office, they may or may not be directly involved in doing that risk assessment, but they certainly need to be aware of it before they start spending dollars with subawardees. The third area is internal controls. Now this is an area that has become different from the past in that they have written this throughout the entire grant regulation of the importance of internal controls, both that you have them in place and also that they're working as expected. And this is something that's going to impact every single department. The third area is the cost principles, and this has to do with making sure that any policies or procedures related to the cost principles, as well as grant staff's understanding of the cost principles, is updated for any changes that have happened with the new grant regulations. The next area is time and effort reporting. Now, time and effort reporting has been part of federal awards for a long time, but they have strengthened some of the oversight and monitoring requirements, so you'll want to make sure that you are aware of how that will impact your department when it comes to spending time and effort on federal awards, and that the people both filling out time cards or similar methods and also the people approving them are aware of what the new requirements are. And finally, the requirement for a well-trained workforce, like internal controls, is something that's going to be pervasive throughout all of the departments and impact each one of them. No longer is it enough just to train 1 or 2 people off in some other department to understand the grant regulations. The federal government has put an emphasis on making sure that everyone who has the ability to spend time or dollars on federal awards is trained to understand what those requirements are so that the grant dollars can be spent effectively and efficiently. The second department that's going to be impacted by the change to the new grant regulations is Human Resources. Why is that? Well, a lot of the policy requirements having to do with supporting women in the STEM fields, science and technology, engineering and mathematics, will be driven by Human Resources. There's also a requirement for beefing up conflict of interest policies. So even though you may have conflicts of interest policies in place, you want to make sure that all the major components that are spelled out for in the new grant regulations are covered also in your conflict of interest policy. Once again, internal controls is a bigger deal than it's ever been in the past. So Human Resources wants to make sure that they also have the means to make sure that internal controls are in place and working as expected. There are new disclosure requirements for violations of law and violations of conflict of interest that your Human Resources Department will need to be aware of and potentially have to disclose items to the federal government in accordance with the new grant regulations. There are also more monitoring requirements, and this has to do both with time and effort reporting and then to make sure that there are disclosures made as needed for anything that is a conflict of interest, a violation of law, and also in the certification of costs, because that may involve higher level staff members, that they're aware of what they're signing and what the implications are, since it is now part of the False Claims Act, which it has been in the past, but again, we want to make sure that people signing those certifications are aware of the ramifications if they make misstatements. In procurement, we have things like contract provisions which need to be updated, so procurement needs to be involved in getting those updated. There's also beefed up monitoring and reporting, so if your suspension and debarment monitoring is a little shaky, you want to make sure that that is compliant. Also, the conflict of interest has much to do with procurement, so they want to be aware of what that is. Internal controls, as we mentioned before, is something throughout the organization that people now need to have a better understanding of what that means and how do they tell if they're working with good internal controls or not. Written policies and procedures will need to be updated, not just for any reference to old guidance. You want to make sure they're referencing the new guidance as well. But also, is there any area that's missing that is called out for in the new guidance? You want to make sure that your policies and procedures are up to date with that. We talked a little bit about the disclosures. This can be part of procurement depending on who's signing things and disclosing them, but you want to make sure that the procurement staff is understanding that violations of law and conflicts of interest are now things that must be disclosed. That's now a mandatory disclosure. And finally, procurement, as well as other departments, needs to have a well-trained workforce. And this means that they have an understanding of the grant regulations, even though they may not be working directly on the award, that they have to have an understanding of what the regulations say so that they can apply that in their day-to-day work as well. And finally, finance and accounting may need to update any cost principle training that they have so that those are up to date with the latest cost principle requirements. There's also a new emphasis on audit resolution, so if your organization has had some findings in the past, possibly corrective action plans, you want to make sure that finance and accounting understands that there's going to be more weight put to assessing whether or not audit findings have been a constant issue in the risk assessment, which will be done by the federal agency. So the importance of cleaning up those old audit findings is more important than ever before. There's also will be a need for written policies and procedures to be updated. Typically, procurement and finance and accounting are the heaviest to the written procedure area, so those will need to be updated both with the new citations and any other changes in policies or procedures. Internal controls, those should be in place, but you want to make sure that finance and accounting is aware that there's a monitoring component to make sure those internal controls are working as expected. The certification of costs may be signed by someone in the finance and accounting department, so you want to make sure that they understand what the ramifications are of making misstatements in that area. And then, of course, the well-trained workforce, which we're seeing in every department, is more and more important, that even though people in finance and accounting may not be working directly on the federal award, that they do need to have an awareness of what those grant requirements are so that they can do their part to help monitor the spending of taxpayer dollars as well. Well, if that seems like a lot to remember, I want to alert you that we have included a department survey template. It's in an editable Word document, and you will be able to use that as a starting point to do some assessments on the various departments and see where they are as you start your implementation plan. Well, that wraps up our fourth video in Module 2, and as we move into Module 3, we're going to look at involving others in the implementation. So in this module, we'll spend more time in determining who should be involved in the implementation, how do you set up an implementation team, what roles and responsibilities should the various team members have, and how to plan a timeline and some common milestones into your implementation plan for the new grant regulations, also known as the OMB Super Circular.